Jinwoo, our disgusting, filthy vermin, found himself standing in front of two baddies. One of them was an elf, while the other was a dwarf. The elf introduced herself as Alice, and she immediately began clinging to him, while insisting that he should not miss what she called a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity with her. She confidently claimed that the two of them could even have beautiful children together in the future. Meanwhile, the dwarf, whose name was May, leaned closer to Alice and whispered something to her in annoyance before stepping toward Jinwoo herself. She started telling him that she was far better than arrogant women like Alice, and promised that she would provide him with anything he could ever want. Jinwoo, however, remained completely confused by the absurdity of his new situation. In his mind, he kept wondering whether this entire world was truly filled with marriages between elves, dwarves, and all kinds of unbelievable nonsense. He could not even tell whether the two women were being serious, or if they somehow expected him to blindly believe every word they were saying. After all, he had always been nothing more than an ordinary young man who spent most of his life trying to work hard, earn money, and save whatever he could. He remembered how his employers and colleagues used to speak highly of him, often describing him as a genuinely good man. They would praise him for being young, gentle, responsible, and dependable, saying that people like him were difficult to find nowadays. Sometimes they would even bring up the topic of his missing father, which always left a lingering emptiness inside him. Jinwoo reflected on his lonely life, thinking about how he had spent years isolated from others. He had already accepted the idea that he would probably continue living alone in his quiet house for the rest of his life. Being distant from people had become natural to him, and solitude was now something he had grown used to. Returning to the present situation, he stared at the two women standing in front of him as they continued arguing with each other. In disbelief, he thought about how, out of nowhere, an elf and a dwarf had suddenly appeared inside his peaceful home one day. At first, he had been startled and immediately questioned their identities. In response, both of them had looked directly at him and explained that they had something important they needed to tell him. After hearing their explanation, Jinwoo had been left utterly shocked. He could hardly believe what they were asking of him. In confusion, he questioned whether they truly expected him to marry one of them and become the king of their world. Both women had answered without hesitation that it was exactly what they wanted. Alice had then explained that Jinwoo's father was once the hero who had saved their world, and because of that, it was only natural for them to want Jinwoo as their king now. May had also insisted that he needed to marry one of them and take the position of ruler in their world. Hearing this only deepened Jinwoo's disbelief as he reflected on the shocking revelation about his father. He found it impossible to process the idea that his missing father had once been regarded as the hero of another world. Jinwoo then questioned them further, wondering aloud whether his father had died while trying to save their world. He bitterly assumed that the two of them were only there because they wanted to use someone like him once again in the ongoing conflict between their races. He told them that the situation was ridiculous and nowhere near as simple as they were making it sound. He firmly declared that he had absolutely no intention of marrying either of them and insisted that he would never marry women like them in the first place. In response, May suddenly bowed deeply in front of him. She sincerely apologized on behalf of the dwarves for the death of his father and admitted that asking him to become their leader after such a tragedy was naturally frustrating for him. However, she pleaded with him once more, explaining that if he accepted her as part of his family, she would dedicate herself to repaying him in every way she possibly could. Alice immediately looked at May with irritation and mocked her statement. She argued that Jinwoo would never simply accept just anyone as his family. According to Alice, becoming his family required far more than empty words. She boldly implied that if May truly wished to become part of Jinwoo's family, then she would first need to prove it properly. Alice then shamelessly declared that whichever one of them managed to win Jinwoo's heart and create a family with him would ultimately be considered the true victor in the situation. All of this left Jinwoo completely stunned, as the bizarre turn of events had escalated far beyond anything he could have ever imagined. Jinwoo reflected on his life and realized that one thing he had learned from living in a shared house was that people adapted far better than anyone expected. Even now, Alice, the princess of the elves, was trying to involve herself in endurance training with him, and somehow, the situation had evolved into princesses from another world, fighting over him as though it were completely natural. Before Alice could properly begin the conditioning training with him, May suddenly entered the room. She looked around suspiciously before commenting that she had thought it was unusually quiet, and seeing the two of them together only confirmed her suspicions. She reminded Alice that they had already made a promise that neither of them would try getting close to Jinwoo unless he personally gave them permission. May, who was the princess of the dwarves, spoke firmly while glaring at Alice. However, Alice only clicked her tongue in annoyance and replied that all the constant talk about promises was becoming irritating. She confidently declared that it was obvious she would be the winner in the end anyway, so there was nothing wrong with her doing cardiovascular training together with Jinwoo. At that moment, another girl suddenly entered the room. Her name was Minji Choi. The moment she stepped inside, she coldly remarked that there was an old saying claiming that black-haired beasts were never meant to be tamed, and she sarcastically added that blondes should probably be included in that saying as well. She then glared directly at Alice before stating that she could have reported her to the police but had decided to let it slide only for Jinwoo's sake. However, she angrily added that trying to stab her in the back like this was something completely unforgivable. Jinwoo quietly reflected on her words while thinking about Minji herself. She was the daughter of the owner of the cheap boarding house where he lived. Minji crossed her arms and firmly declared that she would not let the matter go so easily this time. Alice immediately fired back at her accusation, pointing out that Minji herself had also tried doing the exact same thing before but had merely disguised it as an innocent mistake. Watching the two women argue once again, Jinwoo reflected on how drastically his life had changed. Until only a week ago, he had been living an entirely ordinary life, but somehow he had suddenly become caught in the middle of a strange conflict involving princesses from different worlds. He thought back to his normal routine before all of this chaos began. He used to work at a construction site, and all of his co-workers appreciated him because of how hard-working he was. Thanks to his physical strength, he could carry several heavy items at once without struggling, which made him extremely reliable at work. After finishing work one day, one of his co-workers had invited him to go out drinking together with the rest of the team. The man explained that they simply wanted to thank Jinwoo for always helping them finish their work earlier and praised him for how hard he worked every single day. He warmly insisted that they wanted to treat him to drinks before he left. However, Jinwoo politely apologized and explained that he already had important plans for the day. Even so, he sincerely thanked them for their kindness and thoughtfulness before leaving the site. As Jinwoo walked away, one of the co-workers sighed and commented that the young man never spent time hanging out with any of them. Another co-worker replied that they should not pressure him too much like that. The older man who had invited Jinwoo then smiled proudly and explained that the reason he kept trying to get closer to Jinwoo was because he genuinely admired him. He pointed out that despite being young, Jinwoo was diligent, responsible, and hardworking, which were qualities that had become very rare among people his age. The man admitted that he had been trying to get closer to Jinwoo for a long time, but Jinwoo never really gave anyone the chance. Because of that, he could not help but wonder whether Jinwoo was hiding some kind of painful story deep inside himself. Jinwoo quietly stared at the locket in his hand, where a small family photograph was attached. As he looked at it, he reflected on his past and thought about how his father had gone missing 10 years ago without leaving behind a single explanation. His mother, on the other hand, had passed away from illness 3 years earlier after raising him completely on her own. Unlike Jinwoo, she had continued believing in his father until the very end and kept waiting for the man who had abandoned them and disappeared without a word. After completing his shift at work, Jinwoo returned home. As he approached his apartment, he noticed Minji standing outside waiting for him. The moment she saw him, she warmly praised him for his hard work and commented that he must have been exhausted after such a long day. Minji was the daughter of his mother's close friend, and she had always been kind toward him. Jinwoo told her that next time he would personally come to pick up the things himself, instead of making her bring them all the way to his place. However, Minji casually replied that it was completely fine, because she had wanted to go for a walk anyway. While listening to her, Jinwoo reflected on how genuinely kind she was. She often checked up on him like this, even though he rarely opened up to anyone. Minji then handed him several containers and explained that she had accidentally made too many side dishes again, just like before, so she decided to bring some for him. She also handed him a few packs of instant noodles and reminded him that he needed to take better care of his health. Jinwoo thanked her sincerely and promised that he would make sure to eat everything she brought for him. After that, Minji hesitated slightly before admitting that she had not eaten dinner yet. In a quieter voice, she indirectly suggested that they could eat together because she did not really want to have dinner alone. However, Jinwoo looked at the late hour and gently responded that her parents would probably start worrying about her soon. He offered to walk her back home instead. Minji eventually agreed and explained that her house was nearby anyway. Jinwoo pointed out that she had already gone through the trouble of coming all the way there just for him, but she brushed it off casually and told him not to worry about it. Shortly afterward, she quietly said goodbye and left. As Jinwoo watched her walk away, he reflected on his life once again. He realized that he had managed to survive all this time largely because of the kindness and support of many people around him. Even though he was deeply grateful for that, a part of him was also terrified. He feared becoming completely alone once again someday. Because of that fear, he had deliberately decided to keep his distance from people from the very beginning. In his mind, if he never expected anything from anyone, then he would never have to experience the pain of losing them. To him, living that way felt much easier. However, the moment he stepped inside his house, he was immediately greeted by the sight of Alice and May fighting once again inside his living room. After properly introducing themselves to him, Alice proudly explained that she possessed magical abilities that were granted exclusively to elves, and that she could freely control such powers as naturally as breathing. She then confidently declared that she could even throw him into a portal immediately if she wanted to. Before Alice could actually use her magic, May suddenly interrupted and destroyed the spell with ease. She looked unimpressed and commented that the display was disappointing because Alice was nowhere near as powerful as she had expected. Alice immediately became irritated and demanded to know whether May possessed magical stealing stones. She remarked that perhaps the rumors about the dwarves were not entirely false after all, although she mocked May by saying that she still looked like she was struggling. May quickly fired back by sarcastically replying that Alice's eyes seemed to be malfunctioning just as badly as her ears. Soon the two of them were arguing loudly again while Jinwoo simply stood there in disbelief. As he watched the chaos unfold in front of him, he thought to himself that all of this ridiculous nonsense had started all over again. Even though he was witnessing everything with his own eyes, it still felt impossible for him to truly believe any of it. Alice then suddenly turned toward him and explained that he was the son of the brave warrior Shinwoo Young. She proudly declared that his father was a legendary hero who had once saved Overworld, and because of that, they now wished to crown Jinwoo as their new king. May then continued the explanation more seriously. She revealed that around 300 years ago, during a devastating war against the demons, their world had summoned a brave warrior from another realm. That warrior was Shinwoo Young, Jinwoo's father. According to her, he fought endlessly for their sake, and eventually defeated the Demon King. However, the after effects of that battle ultimately cost him his life. May explained that before dying, Shinwoo Young's final thoughts were filled with concern for the people he loved most, his wife and his son. She solemnly admitted that she felt honored to finally be able to pass those final feelings on to Jinwoo himself. Even now, she claimed that it would not be an exaggeration to say that their world continued to exist only because of the sacrifices made by his father. However, she bitterly added that the elves were now the ones threatening the fragile peace that had been achieved through such painful struggles and sacrifices. Alice immediately argued back at May, accusing the dwarves of being the ones who had first schemed to monopolize all the important resources for themselves. May, however, responded calmly and insisted that everything the dwarves had done was completely legitimate from their perspective. As the two of them continued arguing, Jinwoo silently reflected on everything he had learned so far. In his mind, he tried to summarize the entire situation. According to their story, his father had sacrificed himself to bring peace to their world hundreds of years ago. However, despite all those sacrifices, the elves and dwarves were now once again at odds with each other. Since neither side could reach a proper resolution, they had now decided to drag him into their conflict, simply because he was the blood heir of the brave warrior. The more he thought about it, the more it felt as though they merely wanted to place him on a throne as a puppet king and use his existence as an excuse to suppress their opposition. To Jinwoo, it sounded no different from how they had once used his father for their own benefit. After organizing his thoughts, Jinwoo looked directly at both of them and asked about the portal connecting their world to Earth. He questioned whether they truly had the ability to open it whenever they wanted. Alice confidently answered that opening portals was something extremely easy for elves because of their magic. Hearing that answer only made Jinwoo more frustrated. He pointed out that if opening portals was truly that simple, then there was no reason for them to appear only now in front of him. He reminded them that his father had supposedly died 300 years ago in their world, and yet they claimed to have been grateful to him all this time. Jinwoo angrily questioned what exactly they had been doing during those centuries. To him, it felt as though they had only bothered to seek him out once they needed something from him again. Alice tried to interrupt and asked him to listen to her properly for once, but Jinwoo continued raising his voice in anger. He accused them of now trying to use him as nothing more than a pawn in political marriages and power struggles. He firmly declared once again that the entire situation was ridiculous and that he had absolutely no intention of marrying either of them. Alice looked genuinely surprised by his reaction and hurriedly explained that there seemed to have been some kind of misunderstanding. She insisted that she personally had not been fully aware of everything from the beginning and claimed that she was not the only one responsible for the situation either. While the argument continued, May suddenly lowered her head and sincerely apologized once again. She admitted that even if only part of the dwarves were truly responsible, their actions still deserved blame. She explained that they had not realized how painful and unfair their request would sound to someone like Jinwoo, especially considering the sacrifices his family had already endured. She told him that it was only natural for him to feel angry and frustrated toward them. Because of that, she wished to make proper amends for the wrongs committed against him if he would allow her the chance. However, Jinwoo was still unconvinced. He bluntly replied that he was not a fool and pointed out how flustered May had become earlier when Alice started revealing certain things. He accused May of pretending to be different from Alice, even though, from his perspective, the two of them were ultimately the same. Alice immediately took the opportunity to mock May, claiming that her clever schemes had only ended up backfiring on her. Alice then proudly declared that unlike the dwarves, she did not share the same selfish mindset as the underground people. She insisted that there must have been unavoidable reasons behind the elves' actions and confidently stated that she still believed in her own people. Jinwoo quickly questioned her about those so-called unavoidable reasons. He sarcastically asked whether there could possibly be any excuse good enough for abandoning his father's family for 300 years. He accused them of playing around with his life and emotions while acting as though their excuses would suddenly make everything acceptable. For a brief moment, Alice seemed unable to answer him properly and quietly admitted that she herself did not fully know all the details. However, she then insisted that the best way for him to discover the truth would be to visit their world personally. According to her, it would not be too late for them to apologize afterward once he understood the full situation. She even promised that she would cooperate with him as much as possible if he chose to investigate everything himself. Jinwoo responded sharply by saying that if someone truly intended to take responsibility for their actions, then they should do it properly, instead of simply bowing their heads and brushing everything aside the way most people did. He accused them of acting as though apologies alone were enough to erase years of suffering. Alice tried defending herself once again by explaining that they had actually planned to conduct a proper investigation into the matter before everything became so chaotic. However, Jinwoo immediately interrupted her and bitterly remarked that they were only saying such things now after he had already become involved. May quickly objected and insisted that he was misunderstanding the situation and speaking without knowing the full truth. She repeatedly claimed that things were not as simple as he believed. Finally, overwhelmed by the constant arguing between the two women, Jinwoo raised his voice and firmly asked both of them to stop talking for a moment. Suddenly, the portal that had been floating in front of them disappeared without any warning at all. The bright magical energy that had filled the room vanished instantly, causing everyone present to stare at the empty space in confusion. Alice's expression immediately changed as she looked at the place where the portal had been only moments ago. In disbelief, she muttered that something strange was happening because there was absolutely no way the portal should have collapsed like that. She quickly raised her hand and began trying to use her magic again, attempting to reopen the connection between the two worlds. However, despite repeatedly casting the spell, nothing happened. Watching her struggle for the first time, May narrowed her eyes suspiciously before asking whether there was some kind of problem with her magic. Alice immediately denied it and stubbornly insisted that there was no issue at all. She claimed that she had simply misspoken for a moment, and that the portal could obviously still be opened without difficulty. However, the slight panic visible on her face made it clear that she herself was becoming frustrated. May quickly took the opportunity to mock her. She sarcastically pointed out how Alice constantly bragged about the noble magical powers possessed only by elves, yet now she could not even perform something as basic as reopening a portal. May impatiently told her to stop wasting everyone's time and simply open it already, if there truly was no problem. Hearing those words only irritated Alice even more. Her pride as an elf princess had clearly been wounded. She glared at May and angrily declared that if May wanted proof so badly, then she would properly show her the true power of elven magic. The atmosphere inside the room suddenly changed. Magical energy rapidly gathered around Alice as the pressure in the air became noticeably heavier. A powerful light started forming around her body while she focused entirely on the spell. Then, in the very next moment, the portal burst open once again. A blinding light exploded across the room, so bright that Jinwoo instinctively shielded his eyes. The magical energy radiating from the portal was far stronger than before, making the entire house shake slightly under the pressure. Jinwoo stared at the scene in complete shock while May calmly observed Alice's magic. May then explained that Alice had raised her mana output to its absolute limit. According to her, Alice was currently casting the spell, using the maximum amount of magical power she could possibly release, because she had become genuinely angry. Hearing that only made Jinwoo even more nervous. As he watched the overwhelming magical energy filling the room, memories from the past suddenly resurfaced inside his mind. A terrible feeling immediately crept over him as he remembered what had happened only a week ago. Panic appeared on his face as he quickly shouted at Alice, desperately asking her to stop immediately before something terrible happened again. At that moment, Jinwoo reflected on the incident from a week earlier. Back then, a similar argument between Alice and May had also escalated because of magic. In the middle of their fight, Alice had lost control of her power, and the result had been catastrophic. His home had been destroyed almost instantly, leaving nothing behind except wreckage. That single accident had completely overturned his life. Overnight, he had fallen into an enormous amount of debt because he had no choice but to take responsibility for all the damages. Later, after Minji learned about his situation, she stepped in to help him, She brought Jinwoo, Alice, and Mei to a small shared house owned by her parents so that they would at least have somewhere to stay temporarily. However, Minji had only agreed to let Alice and Mei live there under specific conditions. Since Jinwoo had been forced to carry the burden of the debt alone because of them, both girls were required to work hard and help repay everything. In addition to that, Minji strictly forbade them from causing further trouble around Jinwoo or involving themselves with him in strange sea training sessions and ridiculous fights inside the house. As Jinwoo thought about their current situation, he reflected on how completely opposite the two girls were, despite both being princesses from another world. One of them had quickly adapted to life on Earth and immediately started working a part-time job within only a few days. The other, however, still refused to properly accept reality and spent most of her time doing absolutely nothing productive. At that moment, Minji's voice suddenly echoed throughout the room as she angrily scolded both Alice and Mei once again. She reminded them that she had already warned them countless times that they needed to work hard if they wanted to continue staying there. Alice, however, still looked dissatisfied. She insisted that once the portal reopened properly and everything returned to normal, she would be able to provide far better living conditions than this small shared house. She proudly claimed that even ordinary nobles in her world lived in luxurious places far beyond anything available there, and implied that their current situation was only temporary. Hearing that arrogant response only made Minji more irritated. She glared at Alice and coldly remarked that it seemed impossible to make her understand reality through simple conversation alone. Sensing that another argument was about to begin, Jinwoo immediately stepped in and stopped everyone. His expression became serious as he explained that the issue was no longer just about repaying debt. While paying back what they owed was important, he believed something else mattered even more. He calmly stated that a truly mature grown-up needed to be capable of earning their own living expenses and taking responsibility for themselves. In his eyes, that was what genuinely made someone dependable and grown up. Jinwoo then bluntly admitted that he personally had no interest in someone who could not even support themselves properly and continued acting irresponsibly like a child. The moment those words left his mouth, the entire room fell silent. Alice froze completely in place. For the first time since arriving in his world, she looked genuinely shocked. She stared directly at Jinwoo in disbelief, before quietly asking whether he had actually rejected her seriously just now, instead of simply pretending to push her away. Her reaction surprised everyone present in the room, including Mei and Minji. Neither of them had expected Jinwoo to speak so honestly and directly. Only after seeing Alice's stunned expression did Jinwoo realize how harsh his words had sounded. He suddenly understood that he had unintentionally scolded her far more seriously than he originally meant to. Alice quietly went up to the rooftop after the argument, clearly upset by everything that had happened earlier. As she stood alone under the night sky, she reflected on Jinwoo's harsh words and reluctantly admitted to herself that trying to win him over through direct physical attraction no longer seemed effective. She realized that forcing herself too aggressively toward him would only push him further away instead of bringing him closer. While thinking deeply about the situation, a faint smirk slowly appeared on her face as another idea came to her mind. She quietly muttered to herself that she needed to do something about the current situation before it became even worse. In her hand, she was holding a small glass, marble-like stone. The marble suddenly began speaking to her in a concerned voice, warning her that remaining in her current condition was extremely dangerous. It explained that a world without mana had become an unexpected variable for her body. According to the marble, if Alice failed to replenish her mana soon, her existence itself could eventually begin to disappear. In the worst-case scenario, her condition could become irreversible. The marble then advised her that she needed to honestly explain the truth to Jinwoo, the heir of the brave warrior, and ask for his cooperation regarding the matter before it became too late. However, Alice immediately brushed aside the warning and told the marble that it was exaggerating the situation too much. She insisted that nobody truly knew what would happen yet, and confidently claimed that everything would probably work out fine in the end. She told it not to worry so seriously about something that had not happened yet. Even so, deep inside her mind, Alice knew she needed to change her approach toward Jinwoo. She reflected on how simply forcing herself on him, emotionally or physically, would never truly make him accept her. Instead, she realized that she needed to make Jinwoo genuinely become attracted to her on his own. As she thought about that, she remembered something the marble had shown her the previous night involving a human man and woman. Watching that interaction had made her realize that sometimes it was better to make the other person willingly come toward you instead of aggressively chasing after them. Although Alice admitted to herself that such a method was not really how she originally wanted things to happen, she still concluded that it was acceptable as long as she ultimately succeeded in winning. While she remained seated quietly on the rooftop with the marble in her hand, she suddenly heard footsteps approaching from behind her. Startled, she quickly turned around and saw Jinwoo standing there. He calmly approached her and asked about the conversation she had been having earlier. The sudden question immediately surprised Alice. Soon afterward, both of them ended up sitting together on the rooftop in an awkward silence beneath the night sky. Jinwoo then directly asked her why she had hidden the fact that her life might actually be in danger. Hearing that question shocked Alice even more because she had not expected him to know about it at all. Before she could even ask how he had found out, Jinwoo stopped her and explained that he already understood enough. He told her that he realized she possessed an incredibly strong sense of pride and dignity. According to him, her title as a princess clearly was not merely for appearance, because she had refused to use something as serious as her own life to emotionally blackmail him into cooperating with her. Jinwoo then admitted that perhaps he had misunderstood her too harshly before. He quietly confessed that he now believed she was actually a far more honorable girl than he originally thought. Alice immediately responded proudly, saying that of course she was honorable. Jinwoo then awkwardly admitted that perhaps his prejudice against her had simply been too strong from the very beginning. Alice looked at him suspiciously and asked whether he was feeling alright because he was suddenly saying things completely different from before. She pointed out how he had always rejected her whenever she brought up the idea of some high-intensity workout sessions with him previously. Jinwoo then honestly explained himself. He admitted that earlier he had not known anything about her real situation and had simply assumed that her only goal was to force him into some kind of political marriage arrangement. Because of that misunderstanding, he had instinctively kept his distance. He also admitted something even more personal. Jinwoo confessed that he had absolutely no experience with relationships or intimacy before, and never imagined that he would suddenly end up in a situation like this. On top of that, Alice herself was extremely assertive and direct toward him, which only made him more nervous. Jinwoo awkwardly admitted that he had rarely ever seen someone as beautiful as Alice before, and because of that, he had become even more hesitant and self-conscious around her. However, he carefully clarified that it was not because he disliked her, or because he truly did not want to spend time with her. After quietly gathering his thoughts for a moment, Jinwoo finally looked directly at Alice and told her that he had made a decision. He calmly stated that this time, he would agree to perform the cardiovascular training session together with her. Those words left Alice completely stunned for a brief moment. Then, after some time passed, the two of them eventually began their high-intensity training sesh together on the rooftop under the quiet night sky. Alice quietly reflected on everything that had happened before she was sent to Jinwoo's world. Long before meeting him, the elves had already been preparing carefully for their political struggle against their greatest rivals, the dwarves. During private discussions among the leading members of the Elven Kingdom, they had concluded that the most effective way to secure control over the heir of the brave warrior was not through force alone, but through emotional influence and marriage. Because of that, they decided that the woman sent to approach Jinwoo needed to be someone extraordinary. They believed that only the greatest woman among the elves would be capable of successfully winning over the heir of the brave warrior and bringing him to their side. After many discussions, Alice had ultimately been chosen. Among the elves, Alice was not simply considered beautiful or talented. She was viewed as exceptional even by royal standards. She possessed what the elves called bloodline manhwa, an extremely rare trait said to belong only to individuals born with every quality the elves valued most. From childhood, she had been raised as someone special and superior to others. She had always been praised, admired, protected, and treated as the pride of the elves. Because of that upbringing, Alice had grown up almost never experiencing rejection, failure, or humiliation. She had always been one of the most privileged individuals in their world, and deep down she believed that most situations would naturally go according to her will eventually. However, things with Jinwoo were completely different from anything she had expected. Meanwhile, during the middle of Alice's fitness training session together with Jinwoo, Minji and Mei entered the room at the same time, both looking extremely serious. The moment they saw the two of them together, Minji immediately raised her voice and demanded that they stop right away.